Please welcome Ed Phillips.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, we're okay. Well, it's great to be here again. And today we're going to focus in a little bit more on some different personalities, and specifically Walter Beech and Olive Ann Beech in the Chevolair days. And I'd like to start with the logo here for Chevolair, and also their particular phrase that they like to use, the standard of aircraft comparison. And in the late 1920s, it was indeed the standard. A little statistic to share with you as we get started. By 1929, Chevolair, down on East Central, was building 25% of all certificated aircraft in the United States. Now that's a fact. It's right there in the directory. However, you know what happened in 1929 with the crash and things of that nature, and we'll talk about that. But this was a company that was not only well run, but well respected, but their airplanes were at the top of the technology ladder as well. So let's venture into this, and when this program is done, we'll have a little Q&A, and then I believe Eric is going to have a 10-minute intermission, and then we'll come back and look specifically at the Type R Chevolair racing monoplanes. We'll kind of focus in on that a little bit more. As I said yesterday, if all of you were here, you remember E.M. Laird. E.M. Laird was really absolutely pivotal in getting the Wichita aviation industry started for the air capital of the world. And he came from Chicago in 1919, and Jake Mellendick was able to get him to come down here. And he built the Laird Swallow, and about 40 of those were built, partly in downtown Wichita here, and then the rest up on North Hillside. And it was a very good airplane. It was a three-place airplane, a little bit better than the standard World War I trainers that it eventually replaced. Now, Walter Beech came to Swallow in 1922. He had learned to fly after World War I at the base down in Waco, Texas, and he was an enlisted pilot and proved himself to be a very competent airman. And then in 1922, he came to Wichita and was hired by Mellendick to work at Swallow. And even though Matty Laird told me in 1982 that Mr. Beech was a pilot of limited experience, he soon proved to be a very able salesman and a demonstration pilot and very competent. And a lot of the trophies that Eric is talking about, if you go down there and see them today, a lot of them are aerobatic contests and air racing in Swallows, of which Mr. Beech won. And it was critical to do that because it took a lot of money to run an airplane company. And it still does take a lot of money to run an airplane company. For those of you who know aviation, you know what I mean. They go hand in hand. But in order to meet the payroll and to keep the plant going, a lot of that fell on his shoulders. And he did a good job. There were other pilots too, but he was the main one out there selling a $6,000 airplane when you could get a World War I surplus trainer for $500. So it was a tough business. But that was one of his talents. I want to mention Mr. Stearman only in passing here because this is one of the few shots of the building here in downtown Wichita where they started building the Swallow initially. And Lloyd Stearman is the one on the far left there, a very young man building the Swallows, and the Swallows were all built out of wood. And the reason I mention that becomes important later on when we're talking about Chevolair, when there was a technology debate between Jake Mellendick and Walter Beech and Lloyd Stearman about how to build an airplane. What do you build it out of? And this is a well-known story, and of course I wish I would have been able to talk to all three of those men for that matter, but that wasn't possible. But we think we have a general idea of what happened. But you notice the big windows and all the natural light, and that was a very good characteristic of a lot of airplane factories in the United States at that time. And Jake Mellendick, again, just remember he is certainly the man who's responsible for bringing this industry to Wichita, making it the air capital of the world. The new Swallow was a Lloyd Stearman design in 1924, and this is the pivotal year because Matty Laird had left because of a falling out between Laird and Mellendick. Matty Laird could no longer tolerate Mellendick's high-handed dictatorial management, and he said, I'm out. So he took 2 airplanes and some money, went to Chicago, and built custom airplanes. Basically, he had some production airplanes, but a lot of them were expensive racing and sportsman pilot airplanes and did very well. Earl Beech, again, not related at all to the Beech family, but he was a local pilot, and he's posing there with the new Swallow. Now, I want to notice a couple of things on the new Swallow. The enclosed engine cowling around the Curtiss OX5, a simplified landing gear, but it was still basically a wood airplane. And in 1924, Mr. Beech and Mr. Stearman approached Mellendick, as the story goes, and said, why don't we build the fuselage out of welded steel tubing? Now that was nothing new. That was not a new technology. If you remember World War I, if you know anything about the ACEs and all that, the Fokker D7 was a welded steel fuselage. I mean, welded steel fuselage was not new, but it hadn't been incorporated in a small commercial airplane. That's what made the difference. However, Mellendick said, someone quoted him as saying, it looks good in wood and that's the way it's going to stay. You know, and so Walter and Lloyd decided, well, we don't really like that. So one day they went down to Rago, Kansas. Everybody know where Rago is? Heard of Rago, Kansas? Okay. Rago, Kansas was Clyde Cessna's home. And at that time, he was really not in aviation. His day had kind of passed in terms of the pre-war years, which is what he's showing here when he did his exhibition flying. Eldon Cessna, his son, told me a long time ago in an interview that he and his dad ran a custom threshing business. And that was big business in World War I, because who'd you have to feed in World War I? What's that old term? The doughboys? All right? Kansas was critical in that, getting the wheat to make the bread to feed the soldiers. So that is what Mr. Cessna did. However, when they went down to talk to him, they said, we're going to start a new company, but don't tell anybody. We want to start a new company. This is what kind of airplane we want to build. Will you be willing to come on? And he thought about it and eventually said, yeah, okay, I'll get into it. Because remember yesterday I said his passion, Mr. Cessna's passion, was not flying airplanes, but it was what? Building airplanes. That's what he wanted to do. All right? Lloyd Stearman's passion was designing airplanes. Walter Beech's passion was flying airplanes and selling them. So there you go. I got that wonderful mix. I think it's neat. This is familiar to some of you here. As a matter of fact, look at that building there. Interesting. Yeah, the Broadview Hotel. Just beyond the Broadview Hotel, it looks like it's a white building, is the first Cevolair plant. And it was actually the Kansas planing mill. That's what it says on the sign. And the Breitweiser brothers allowed Cessna, Stearman, and Beech to start in a 30 by 30 foot building all the way at the back. And that's where they built the first Cevolair. And the name Cevolair is where it came from the best information I've been able to find. I'm not satisfied with it, but it's the best I've been able to find, was a school contest for children to name the company. And they came up with Cevolair. And it stuck. So it's a really good one. So you notice the Broadview Hotel, a lot of things have changed since that picture was taken. That's for sure. So that was a very, very important step for the company. This is the first airplane that they built, and it was a Lloyd Stearman design. You notice a great similarity to the New Swallow. Makes sense. It was basically just a New Swallow. It was a totally different airplane, but it's like a New Swallow with a Cevolair name on it. Still a Curtiss OX-5 engine, fully enclosed, a three-place open cockpit biplane, 2 passengers in the front, pilot in the back, and however, it did have a welded steel tube fuselage. So they made that break with Swallow and Mellendick and began to build these airplanes. Well, Henry Ford, you know, he had his Model A, and the Cevolair had their Model A. They had it before Henry did, as a matter of fact, by about 5 years. So that was the Model A. They also built a few of these custom cabin biplanes one was for Gerbach Aeronautical Corporation. They used it to fly Newtone or Nuvitone film from boxing matches and things like that. They'd fly it to the theaters. But they also could carry 4 passengers up there in the front. You can kind of see the windows on the side. And that was a big airplane. You know, the wingspan on a King Air is something around 50, 52 feet. This one was 42 feet. It was a pretty big Cevolair at the time. It could lift a good load. And Lloyd Stearman was responsible for that design, primarily. They ran out of room very quickly downtown there behind the Broadview. And in 1926, they moved up to the Cevolair Airplane Manufacturing Company on West Douglas. This building still stands. It's been a motorcycle dealership. It's gone through a number of inhabitants, so to speak, but businesses. However, this is taken. You notice in the window it says, large or small, we lead them all. And Cevolair was a leader, you know, really from the beginning. Their chief competition was Waco up in Troy, Ohio. That was their biggest competition. And they built some good airplanes up there too. Okay. In 1926, the availability of the war surplus Curtiss engines, which is what almost everybody did. You could get them dirt cheap. You could buy them in a box, coated with cosmolines. Everybody heard of cosmoline. It's a nice grease that preserves metal really well. Very tough to clean off, though. You could buy them for as little as $25 or $50, brand new engine. So that's why everybody used the Curtiss OX5 so extensively. However, in 1926, Wright Aeronautical designed a radial engine, which simply means that the cylinders are arranged in a circle, and it's very compact. It produces more power per pound of weight. And Walter Beech decided, since at that time he was the president of Chevolair, we need to move forward on this technology. So they bought one of these engines, $8,000 for one engine, just the engine. Hadn't even built the airplane yet. But he knew that that was the way of the future. So this particular airplane here was built for a W.B. Howe here in town. He used it to fly the oil fields. And one of the different pilots flew him, including Walter Beech. So this was a very successful airplane. You also notice the propeller is not wood, it's twisted steel. All right, that was something else that was coming along at that time, a twisted steel propeller. This was a 200 horsepower engine. You needed a propeller to absorb that power. So they called this the type BW, and W for Wright, and B meaning it's not the Model A. So they continued to develop their particular type of classifications. Now I have to mention Cessna here because it's important to our discussion. In 1926, Cessna designed this little monoplane at his own time and his own money outside of Chevolair. And it said it could be converted in 5 minutes to an air ambulance. It carried 5 passengers. And it was an interesting idea. Walter Beech flew it and liked it. He liked it a lot. He said, hey, this is another area where we can develop a product. And sure enough, later on, they did actually build an airplane based on this. And there it is. In the Type 5000. And they built these for National Air Transport, which was up in Chicago and Kansas City. And that was based on Cessna's monoplane after Cessna, Stearman, and Beech all put their heads together and came up with a larger version of that airplane. But it's still basically the same configuration, as you can see. Powered by, again, a Wright radial engine. And the pilot sat up high in a little cupola, which he could take off in the summertime and just fly in an open cockpit. That was kind of fun. They enjoyed that. I got to mention this here. Forgive me, but you notice there's a little protrusion right here. I don't know if you can see that. Anyone want to guess what that was for? Flying along, low altitude, lots of bumpy air. Passengers? Air sick, yes. And that was what that was for. Do I need to say any more? No, we'll move along. Okay. Also, in 1927, Lloyd Stearman left and went out to California. Was there for a brief time, trying to sell airplanes to Hollywood stars, didn't work. Came back to Wichita, so just kind of mentioning that. And then Cessna opened his own factory and began to build an airplane similar to the Phantom. And that's in another program, however, so we're going to leave that behind. Back to Chevolair. On East Central Avenue, when the West Douglas plant got so full that they were just banging into each other, the demand was so high, they were able to get investors and get the money they needed to build a factory, one building out on East Central Avenue. And that's where the flying field was, which is now Beech Field, of course. It was known as Chevolair Field a little bit later. And this is in the summer of 27 on the East Central when the building was just being finished. They were moving parts in and equipment and building airplanes as fast as the contractor could vacate the area. It was like building right behind them. And you can see one of the, actually there's 2 of the NAT airplanes there. And they had a strict schedule to have to deliver those, and they did that. And the airplanes flew on different airmail routes, but a lot of them went from Chicago to Kansas City, Wichita, Dallas at night, flying passengers and airmail. So it was quite an airplane for them. Also, everybody remembers Lindbergh in May of 1927 and what he did. But a few months later, in August, Art Goebel, who is on the left here, who was a Hollywood stunt pilot, by the way, and Mr. Phillips, which was in the center, no relation to me, unfortunately, but anyhow, and his father, they backed Chevolair to build 2 airplanes for the Dole race. Everybody eats Dole pineapples, you know about the Dole race. He was in Hawaii, a wealthy man who said, hey, they went to Paris, I'll give $25,000 to the first pilot in a commercial airplane that can fly out here nonstop. Well, it had to be nonstop because there's nothing but water in between. And the Woolaroc successfully made it. And the navigator for that was William Davis, who was a lieutenant in the Navy. They borrowed him from the Navy. And I remember that according to some of the notes in the Chevolair records, Mr. Beech was a little skeptical about building this airplane because it was a risk. What if the airplane went in the Pacific Ocean? Not good public relations for Chevolair, but he went ahead and did it. And the airplane won, and it's now in Bartlesville, totally restored, and it's hanging in a museum. Everybody been to that museum in Bartlesville and seen it? Okay, you know what I mean. And it's hanging on a heading to Honolulu, if you didn't know that. Yep, hanging on a heading to Honolulu. So quite an airplane. I still have some fabric from this airplane, as a matter of fact, in my collection, which is a real Chevolair blue. And it didn't get faded out. All right, now some of the other airplanes that they built. The Model A, if you remember, was the first airplane that they built. It evolved into the Type 2000, essentially the same airplane, but they were able to drop the price, and pretty soon they were selling these for about $3,000, $3,500, brand new. This one went to the Harvard Flying Club. I think I said that right. Anyway, the Harvard Flying Club, there were lots of flying clubs then. Everybody wanted to get into the air because it was the post-Lindy era. They also built about 30 of these Type 3000 airplanes, which were very similar to the Model B, except it had a Wright Hispano-Suiza engine on the front, an upright V8, about 150 horsepower. Chevolair did not stock those engines in their factory. The customer had to order the airframe and then go find the engine themselves and provide it to the factory. And the factory would hang it and test fly it, or you could buy the airframe without an engine and then ship it back to wherever you wanted it, and then eventually you could find an engine to put on it. But it was a water-cooled airplane, not very many built, but a very good airplane at that time. They also built the Type W4000, which had a small radial engine built by Warner Scarab, it was called, the Scarab. So it was a smaller airplane, but very popular with a Scarab engine, 110 horsepower Chevolair. Not very many built. And the E4000, this was the economy Chevolair. This was basically their entry-level airplane with a 165 horsepower Wright radial engine. A lot of flight schools bought these and used them for student training because they were economical. But they were not fast. They also built what some people call the anteater Chevolair. You can see the long nose involved there. And that was powered with a Kinner, a little 5-cylinder Kinner engine. Only a handful were built, not very popular. Most everybody wanted a Wright radial engine or a Hispano-Suiza power plant. And then only one of these was really built. This was the Fairchild Caminez 4-cam engine, and it's very small, and it turned very low RPM. The propeller was huge in order to turn, so it turned at a very slow RPM. And Clarence Clark, who was a test pilot at Chevolair, you'll hear more about him later, he told me before he died in an interview, and he said it was one of the worst engines he ever flew behind. And so because of the fact that it gave trouble, Chevolair never offered it. But they did designate it a Type 8000. Now then, this, in my opinion, is the first King Air. You listen, you say, Ed, you're nuts. No, I don't think so. Hear me out. In 1928, Horace Weimiller was hired by Beech to design a monoplane that was different than the Type 5000. He wasn't aiming at the airline market. He was aiming at the businessman. Here we go, business aviation. Now, he wasn't the only one doing that, but Chevolair was at the forefront once again with a brand new airplane designed to carry 6 people at about 100 miles per hour for several hundred miles at least. And when Weimiller was done with this, it was a very successful demonstrator. Now, Walter Beech took that airplane and flew all over the country with it in the summer of 1928. He first flew in March, and he sold airplanes. He and another one of the company pilots went with him. And the businessmen liked it. They said, we got one complaint. It's too small. He said, okay, no problem. So he made it bigger. Now, this is the actual production, Type 6000B, and I'll tell you a little bit about the name on there in a minute. But this was the production airplane that the businessmen bought. And they sold over 150 of these. They were selling like hotcakes. They were very popular, very reliable, Wright radial engine once again. And some of the things that I say is the first King Air, it was really one of the earliest designed for the purpose business aircraft. Designed for that purpose only. Now you notice there's a porthole in there because it had a potty in the back. King Airs all have potties, most of them. It also had hot and cold running water in the sink and the mirror. It was an option. So they went out of their way. Now, not bring that up again, but you see that little tube out the bottom is still there. Okay. All right, enough said about that. Now, smiling through, how many of you ever had oh, geez, how do you like that? No, I went totally blank. Does that ever happen to you? Maytag washing machine. Maytag, this is the company, the Maytag company up in Iowa. And H.L. Ogg bought this airplane and had it specially outfitted to carry washing machines and demonstrate them to people. Yeah, and he was an optimist. So he said, I want my airplane called Smiling Through, because we smile through everything. Everything's good, ladies and gentlemen. We smile all the time at this company. So the automatic washing machine company was smiling through. And I don't think I have a shot of it here in this program, but the pilot had a captain's uniform on with epaulets and a hat, everything. He had a secretary who wore a uniform. When she sat in the cabin, she had a desk, she had a dictaphone, she had a typewriter, she had everything she needed, plus the potty in the back for anybody that needed that. And the windows went up and down. They had curtains with nice gold pulls on them. This was well outfitted for 1929. And it was a very successful airplane. It flew for quite a while until it was destroyed, unfortunately. This is one of my favorite shots because a lot of people who came to Chevolair were celebrities. And I bet everybody here has probably heard of Wallace Beery at some point, a famous actor, Lasky's famous players during the 1920s. And this is a good shot there of Mr. Beech. That's what he wore most of the time, was a suit. And he was busy running the company. This is the most powerful Chevolair monoplane they built, and also the most expensive, $20,000 Beery paid for this airplane. And the engine on there is a 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial. And he didn't have a secretary, he didn't have a pilot, he was the pilot. He was an airline transport rated pilot. A lot of people don't know that. And he owned a couple of Chevolairs before he bought this airplane. So when he arrived, he was sick with the flu. He wasn't feeling very good, but he went ahead with all the photo ops and that type of thing. And then they went down to the Orpheum at night and saw a movie, he and Walter Beech. But nevertheless, he was a very competent pilot and used to fly this airplane a lot. Unfortunately, the airplane was destroyed by someone who was not supposed to fly it, did not have permission to fly it, but decided to take his girlfriend for a flight one day, crashed and killed them both. So it's just, it's one of those stories, sad but true. Here's the inside of a typical cockpit of a Chevolair monoplane. And you notice it's got two wheels, steering wheels on there, rudder pedals, the big compass sitting on the left windowsill, and the throttles and spark and mixture all up at the front in the quadrant. Now this was state-of-the-art for 1929. No problem at all. You notice the crank windows. The windows cranked up and down just like a car, and the steering wheel looked just like a car. And of course, Mr. Beech understood that if you can ease people's transitions from things they're used to into things they're not used to, it's good. That's good marketing. It's good product marketing. So he did that. They also built a slightly smaller version called the 10B. This only carried 4 people. It was still powered by smaller right radial engines. They only built 11 of these before the Depression ended Chevolair's era, basically. And they were a good airplane. One has been restored and is flying in the world right now, here in the United States, but only one. And it was very difficult, as you can imagine. A lot of the parts were fabricated by hand by those craftsmen that did do that. 1929, this is where, in the upper left, next to the water tower was the first building that was built. And I showed you that earlier. Since then, 28, 29, 4 more were added. 2 down at the bottom, the 1 up at the top, and then the 1 in the middle with the sawtooth roof. And that, at that point, they could keep up with production demand in 1929. And as I mentioned yesterday, at the height, in the spring and summer of 29, they were running 3 shifts, 6 days a week, trying to build 25 airplanes a week. And they couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it. They still didn't have the capacity. But they built as many as they could. The customers were mad, the dealers were mad because they weren't getting their airplanes. But there was only so much you could do because Mr. Beech was not going to do anything, let's just build it quick and get it out the door. That was not his philosophy. He would make it right, then we'll test fly it, and then we'll deliver it. Let them get mad. You know, I'll deal with them. So it was quality first, and that always paid off. Another type of airplane that came late in Chevolair's time was the B4000. It was a little different, very much like the other biplanes, except that it had an outrigger gear, which simply meant that it had shock absorbers instead of rubber bands to absorb the landing and taxi loads. Built quite a few of those. They also were one of the first companies to build a crop duster. And that's what this is. The Z4D was built specifically to spray for the boll weevil on the cotton fields. Yeah. And there is a hopper in the front instead of a place for two people, and an auger. And if you notice, there's a little propeller right above the right tire. You can barely see it. And that spun as the airplane flew, and that's what churned up the dust inside the bin. And then when the pilot opened the door, it would be sucked out. So it's a pretty simple system. They only built one or two of these. But now, of course, we've got some very sophisticated agriculture airplanes, as you know. Okay, this is one of my favorite parts. Walter Beech loves speed. Don't we all? I like speed. But I remember Clyde Cessna in 1913, when he was still flying early in his career, the reporters asked him, "Why do you fly?" And the quote is, that I think is accurate, he says, "Why, speed is the only reason for flying." So see, speed was everything. And in air racing in the late 1920s, it was like the Super Bowl we're used to today. The national air races were very popular. This airplane is not a Chevolair, nor is it a Beech. It's actually a Cessna. This Cessna AW, about 25 or 30 feet off the ground in a very steep bank in an air race. So, you know, that was a good pilot down there doing that. But let's talk a little bit about airplanes that they built, that Chevolair built. I'm going to go through this very quickly because then we're going to have a 10-minute intermission, and I'm going to change programs, and we will look at detail in these airplanes, okay? The Type R. The Type R monoplane was, again, a very secret project at Beech. Mrs. Beech, during my interviews with her, remembered that very clearly, and I'll talk about that more in the next segment rather than take the time to do that now. But this was an evolutionary airplane, not revolutionary, but it certainly began to break some molds. And I'll give you the story on that a little bit later. This is what it looked like when it was done. Okay. And this was a sister ship to it, just like it, except it had a 6-cylinder inverted Chevolair built by Chevrolet to power this airplane, which you'll hear later on did not exactly please Mr. Beech. So we'll talk about that. Louise Thaden is standing on the right there. During 1929, at the National Air Races up in Cleveland, she won the first Powder Puff Derby. Well, it wasn't called that. Remember the Powder Puff Derby? It's still going on. It was the Women's Air Derby at that time. And she won it in a Chevolair, beat all the other ladies. It was just ladies competing against ladies. And that was a real feather in her cap. And that airplane no longer exists, sadly. It was destroyed. And then we'll see how the second airplane was re-engined and sold to somebody named Pancho Barnes, a very, very colorful person. Shell Oil owned a mystery ship. Frank Hawks and Texaco owned a mystery ship. And the Italian government owned a mystery ship. So we'll look at those in the next segment that we have. In 1932, the Chevolair plant was closed. And let me just going to give a repeat of what I said yesterday. In 1929, Curtiss-Wright absorbed Chevolair. Okay, they became a part of Curtiss-Wright. And Curtiss-Wright, actually being careful with the bottom line and profit, in 1932, there was no production going on. I have Bill Snook's original notes in a small book. And his family allowed me to copy that. And it shows from about February or March of 1930, the orders just go like this. Boom. And it wasn't just Chevolair. Everybody in the aviation industry was having that trouble. A lot of the smaller manufacturers, such as the ones that tried to start in this town that we talked about yesterday, they just died overnight. Chevolair hung on and hung on. This is what they built. Last-ditch effort, Curtiss-Wright Model 12 Chevolair, designed by Ted Wells and Herb Rawdon together. There was a few built here in Wichita, and when they closed the plant in 1932, there were parts for airplanes just sitting in the hangar, sitting in the old Chevolair buildings, but nobody wanted them. So it was a tough time. Mr. Beech went to St. Louis to work, and also New York. Ted Wells went with him as well, K.K. Shaw also. And they tried to build different versions of the old Chevolair monoplanes. It was not very successful. There just wasn't money at that time in 1930, and it only got worse in 1931, 32. Oh, hope that wasn't a bulb. No. All right, so that completes my little brief talk about Chevolair, the standard of aircraft comparison. I'll entertain a few questions before Eric tells us to take a break. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier in the program that around 1922 or something, that those two people went off to Brago to talk to Clyde Cessna.
In 1924, yes.
24. So what did he have going for him that they knew about him, or what was he doing there?
Okay. What Mr. Cessna had was a lot of money. Because the custom threshing business, he was wealthy at that point. And you wouldn't know it from looking at his house or anything like that, but that's just kind of the man he was. But what they went down there for is, will you help us with the money? And he said, yeah, I'll only help you with the money, but I'll give you all my woodworking equipment, which he did, and traveled up to that little plant behind the Broadview and put that in there. He put thousands and thousands and thousands of his own money into the company to get it going. And Walter Beech put up $5,000, and Lloyd Stearman contributed the design for the Model A. So that's how they got going. Now they had C.J. Yankee, they had J.H. Turner, and Walter Innes and other investors helping them. But without Mr. Cessna, I don't think Chevolair would have got started. That's a good question. Anything else? Yes, sir.
The four-place biplane cabin type.
Yes.
Biplane, what kind of a power plant did that airplane have?
They would do two. They had a Wright radial engine, which most of them had. That was the only one that had the Hispano-Suiza upright V8. Yeah. Any others?
Did Herb Rodden go with Walter and Ted Wells?
No, Mr. Robert, he did not. He did not. Ted was the only one of engineering who went down to St. Louis. Yeah, and K.K. Shaw, I think, was there for a while. But no, he didn't, and neither did Walter Burnham at that point. But they're going to show up prominently in the Type R, that's for sure. Hey, John.
I was going to raise the same thing, but didn't he also hire, what was his name, Landgraf in St. Louis?
Yes.
Who did the CW14?
Mm-hmm. Good point. That is correct, yep. And, you know, we're not talking about Beech Aircraft here, but I do want to say something I failed to mention yesterday with Dwayne Wallace. But Dwayne Wallace, when he got out of college here, was hired by Walter Beech, who worked with Ted Wells on some of those early Stagger Wings, and that's not widely known, but it is. And he when I interviewed him, Mr. Wallace, he was mentioning the fact that that was a real good experience for him, right out of college. And he was doing stress analysis, which was kind of a black art back then. No one's really sure how to do it. But he enjoyed that until he was able to help get the Cessna company back. Any other questions? Okay, Eric.
Oh, one more, it looks like.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see it back there because of the pillar. Yes, sir.
The elevator oil field money, you say something about how much of the money actually came from the oil. Was that at the beginning or was that later when they started?
That was more in the Mellendick era, and especially, but I think it was still there, but I don't have any figures on that. I can't give you any figure. I've never seen anything on that, as a matter of fact.
The myth is that the aircraft business got started because of the oil money.
There were some oil men who wanted airplanes, like W.B. Howell there with the Model VW, but they were kind of few and far between at that time. But there was no doubt about it that, you know, oil money figured in.
Well, Mollendick was an oil man to start with.
Sure, yep.